Welcome to the Nursing Post podcast, all nursing all the time with Ashley Moore and Rosa Horsley. In this episode, we discuss a real hard topic of suicide. September is Suicide and Mental Health Awareness Month, and our goal for this podcast is to inform and start conversation regarding suicide.
This week's topic of suicide awareness is not a lighthearted conversation, but it's a necessary one. And it's a much needed conversation to have, not just in the month of September, all year round, every day. If you or someone you know is experiencing suicidal thoughts, please call 1-800-273-TALK. Your life does matter. You may hear us say this phone number multiple times throughout this episode.
Yes. And this episode will probably be a little longer than our normal episode, but we want to make sure that we cover a good amount of information that people can find necessary. So it may be one that you have to kind of split into two parts. So suicide can kind of be put into three different parts. There's a suicide attempt, suicidal ideation, and actual suicide. A suicide attempt is a non-fatal, self-directed, potentially harmful behavior with an intent to die as a result of the behavior. A suicide attempt does not always result in injury, but that wasn't the expected outcome. Suicidal ideation refers to thinking about, considering, or planning suicide. Causes for that are complex and there are multiple determining factors. The goal of suicide prevention is to reduce factors that increase risk and increase risk factors that promote resilience. Suicide is death caused by injuring oneself with the intent to die. So all of these have the one thing in common, that the end result is for death.
Yes, the thought of
whether it's the thought, an attempt, or actual suicide.
Correct. So we love statistics.
We do.
I think everybody about knows that right now in regards to us. So here are the statistics. It's the 10th leading cause of death in the United States.
Which is kind of sad. When you think of all the diseases that are out there and the things that we're managing, and people taking their own life takes top 10.
Top 10. According to WHO, Japan has the highest suicide rate among Asian countries, with more than 30,000 Japanese killing themselves each year. Asian American families are the main factor why suicide is the second leading cause of death for Asian Americans aged 15 to 34. And I was really surprised when reading that.
There was an article, I think we both read it, regarding the thought process of suicide among Asian culture.
Yeah.
And it was kind of sad. It really, I did not understand the thought process of suicide among Asian culture. I just didn't know it. So that was very informative to me. I look back at some of the things that I knew, and maybe deep down in at a subconscious level, I did understand it. But when I read, that if you do something that is considered to disgrace your family,
dishonorable,
that the best way to get out of that is by committing suicide. I was like, that's...
Yeah, I think if I'm understanding this right, is that in order to regroup or remain your family's honor, like,
that's the only way to do it.
Is the way to do that. Suicide contributes to one death every 11 minutes. There were 48,000 deaths in 2018. And in 2018, 10.7 American adults seriously thought about suicide, 3.3 million made a plan, and 1.4 million attempted suicide. Since 1999, the suicide rate has climbed 33%. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for people 10 to 34 years of age. The fourth leading cause among people 35 to 54 years of age, and the eighth leading cause among people 55 to 64 years of age. I think sometimes we hear and watch things so often that it kind of dulls the senses or numbs us.
Yeah.
And until, I actually sat down and read these statistics, I just really didn't understand quite the effect that mental health, a lot of people are having a hard time dealing with.
Right. And the sad part about it is how many people commit suicide and their family or friends say, I never would have guessed.
Yeah, like
they're
they never
always
knew.
so happy. They were never even treated or on anything for mental health at all.
Mm-hmm. Because suicide reasons are so complex and determined by multiple factors, the goal of suicide is prevention and is to reduce those factors in order to promote resilience, as we had mentioned before.
A couple of risk factors is a family history of suicide, a family history of child maltreatment, previous suicide attempts, a history of mental disorders, particularly clinical depression, a history of alcohol or substance abuse, sometimes they go together, a feeling of hopelessness, impulsive or aggressive tendencies, cultural or religious beliefs. So a belief that suicide is a noble resolution of a personal dilemma. That's what we were talking about with the Asian culture. Local epidemics of suicide. So if there's a specific area that's prone to more suicide, I think what happens is that's seen as a resolution to a problem.
A way out.
Yeah. Isolation or a feeling that you're cut off from other people, that can really take a toll. That's one of the things that I know, Rosa, we have discussed about with the pandemic when we're isolating and quarantining, that we'd wondered if the suicide rate would go up because of it. A loss, so whether it's a personal loss, a financial loss, you lose your job, things like that. Barriers to mental health treatment. And by barriers, I want to explain that that's not just a barrier as in they don't have a way to get to the doctor, but in some cultures, treatment of mental health is frowned upon.
Yeah, it's taboo.
Yes. And so that needs to be a thought consideration, especially for nursing and any healthcare provider that's treating a patient.
And other barriers, with mental health medications.
Yes.
It's not one size fits all.
No.
So sometimes you have to try different doses of the same medicine, even, different doses of different medicines, a combination or cocktail. And sometimes that can be expensive.
It can be. And there are times that there's nothing that you can do but wait a certain amount of time to see if it's going to work.
Yeah. Like the normal time is 21 to 30 days.
Right.
For the chemicals to be really effective in your system. And that's hard for somebody that has a real mental health issue.
Yes.
And sometimes the medication itself, I hear a lot of times that patients have gone off of their mental health meds because they didn't like feeling numb.
Right.
Or they didn't like the way it made them feel. So those are some of the barriers when we say barriers to accessing mental health treatment. That's some of the barriers we're talking about.
Right. Not just they can't get to the doctor or they can't afford the copay. There's a lot of other barriers there. That's exactly right. Physical illness can be hard on people, especially new diagnoses, chronic diagnoses that are not going to go away. Patients, sometimes they don't know how to cope with that.
Yeah.
Easy access to lethal methods. So if there's a quick way out and there's easy access to a way that can happen, that
Yeah.
that makes it easier.
Medications, weapons,
Right.
other things as well.
Some people are unwilling to seek help because of the stigma attached to mental health and substance abuse disorder or suicidal thoughts. And this is something that I know I've seen a lot of people trying to get rid of that stigma. It's something that I think that a lot of healthcare providers and practitioners are actively working hard to get rid of.
I watched a documentary because, I love those. And it was surprising to me because my generation, it was considered taboo, something that you didn't talk about. Counseling.
Mm-hmm.
What? And this documentary, it was kind of eye-opening. It actually mentioned that millennials don't feel like mental health is a stigma, and they're more willing to seek treatment when they're able.
Right.
And I thought that was really promising.
Right. Well, I mean, I know that I've heard people say things like, what do you have to be depressed about? There's a
Yeah.
lot of people who have things a lot worse than you do. So that it just goes to show there's not understanding.
Yeah. We still have a long way to go.
We do. And something just to add to that, I think that nurses, in my opinion, we understand that mental health is a real thing, but we need to understand that the stigma for nurses seeking mental health treatment needs to go away.
Absolutely. I feel like that's just another form of bullying.
Right.
Which we already do.
Yeah. And it's kind of one of those things like we understand it's something that's real, but just because somebody that you know is experiencing that, I think it's really considered a little odd if you hear that another nurse is in treatment or something. People are like, oh, what's wrong with them? Like,
Maybe their job. Hello. It's a very stressful job.
It is, but we just need to work on not only getting rid of the stigma for everybody, but the stigma in nursing as well.
Totally agree.
And one of the last risk factors that we have is that suicide rates are higher among there are certain populations that have a higher tendency or a higher rate for suicide, and that are veterans, lesbians, gays, bisexual, transgender, the whole LGBTQ community. They're all kind of at a higher risk. And I mean, to me, it's obvious why, with
and
our
we talk
veterans,
more about that later, too.
with the PTSD and things like that. And then our LGBTQ, and if I missed a letter in there, I'm sorry, community, that whole group, there's a huge stigma and people are just nasty.
People are so ugly people sometimes. And
Like,
I don't
why
mean
does it affect
physically.
you
I mean
who they're with?
ugly people inside. So there are signs of suicide. I think this is probably one of the most important things we'll cover in this episode, because like you said before, there are a lot of people that were like shocked or surprised, or they never saw it coming.
Yes.
So some of those signs and symptoms include talking about killing themselves.
Right.
The feeling of hopelessness, not having a reason to live, feeling as if you're a burden to others, that you're trapped, you're in unbearable pain. You've increased your use of alcohol or drugs, trying to kind of like numb yourself from the pain.
Like a coping mechanism. Yeah.
Looking for a way to end your life, actually researching methods on how to do so. Withdrawing from activities, isolating yourself from your family and your friends. You're sleeping too much or you're not sleeping enough. You're visiting and calling people to tell them, goodbye. You might not actually be picking up the phone and saying, bye, Ashley.
Right.
But you're picking up the phone, maybe having that last conversation with them and telling them you love them and then goodbye. Giving away your prized possessions, being aggressive, fatigued, depressed, anxious, having a loss of interest, being, irritable, having been humiliated or shamed, if you're experiencing agitation and anger and sudden relief or sudden improvement. Like, I think if you've gone through all of those and you're at the relief and sudden improvement part, you've probably made peace with your attempt.
Right.
So those are some of the signs and symptoms to look for, and I'm sure there are more.
Oh, I'm sure there's
know.
something that we missed, but it spans a whole array. So what you have to understand is that you never know what somebody is personally going through.
Absolutely.
So you want to make sure that you don't do something like make a comment about, oh, you should never have been born, or, I think social media is really big with the people saying things like, oh, you
Those
should go
trolls,
jump off a bridge or something like that. Like, you don't understand that, oh, you don't even know that person, but that might be like the straw that broke the camel's back comment, that they were already thinking about suicide, and then you're going to say something like that. But
you were the last comment that pushed them over the edge.
Right.
Yeah.
And of course, that person would never know that personally, but that kind of goes back to, if you don't have anything nice to say,
then don't say it at all.
Right.
Yeah. Or maybe just treat people how you want to be treated.
Well, that would be a crazy thought process.
I mean, just imagine being nice.
We start with like baby steps here.
Let's work on ourselves.
Yep.
Effects of suicide are for all ages, genders, races, and socioeconomical classes. So it's not just one demographic. It happens to everybody.
Right. And we kind of broke this down into some sections, so that way it would be kind of
easier
to talk about and group people together a little bit. Like, children and teenagers have risk factors that maybe some other people don't.
Absolutely. And you might be, unfortunately, just in every one of these categories.
Yes.
So children and teenagers, they're often the victims of, bullying, and like Ashley had mentioned, on social media. And, sometimes they suffer from abuse, physical, mental, emotional, sexual. And if not given the correct outlet to express and to talk things through, they contemplate and have committed suicide.
Right. And the LGBTQ family or group, when you are a lesbian, gay, bisexual, whatever you identify as, at the age 18 through 25, they were 4 times more likely than straight young adults to report planning or attempting suicide within the previous year.
That's just crazy.
It is. And transgender and non-binary adults are pretty much at the same risk. There should be somebody who loves and accepts them as they are, no matter how a person identifies or who they love.
Equality, I think, is the biggest word for 2020.
Yes. School should make a place where the LGBTQ youth are accepted and not discriminated against. I know I went to high school with 2 people that were openly gay, and one was a gentleman and one was a female. The female was actually my first roommate. But she was openly discriminated against, in the little town that we grew up in, where everybody knew everybody.
Yeah.
And it was very difficult for her to accept what her body was going through. I remember her being very upset, making comments like, what's going to happen to me? She was raised and is a Christian. So it took a very big toll on her. And I remember just looking at her one day saying, if the worst thing you do in life is love another woman, there are people out there that are worse than you.
I absolutely agree.
I'm just saying, if that's the worst thing you do with your life is spread love, and it just so happens to be to a woman, I mean, who cares? And she just looked at me and she's just like, it doesn't bother you? I'm like, no.
Why would it?
It didn't bother me at all.
I don't understand. This is a hard thing for me. Discrimination, inequality. It's like one of my biggest pet peeves.
Right.
I don't understand it.
I remember, and of course we were kids, but I remember some of the guys being like, well, how come she gets to go to the women's bathroom if she finds women to be attractive?
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, are you kidding me?
There's just so much ignorance.
Do you like every woman you look at? No. Well, why in the world would you think she does?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I just never understood that. Like,
no, I
way
don't
to put
understand.
yourself on a pedestal there to make somebody think that
People are so small-minded. I just can't.
Right. And
Yeah.
I mean, and so it was kind of one of those things where it was difficult. And for the gentleman, he was always very nice, but never really had male friends because it was a stigma. Like, oh, well, he likes me. I'm like, he's got better taste
than you. It's just like that Stevie Nicks song. Like, I bet you think this song is about you.
Right.
Like, seriously.
Mm-hmm.
It's incredible.
So it is. And there's not a place for a lot of those students to feel like
welcomed, appreciated.
Exactly. And I'm just kind of, I just don't care who you are or what you are. I'm not gay, but I don't care that you are. Exactly. What you do and your home life doesn't affect me. And if you ask me out on a date, I'm flattered but taken. And
there you go. It's like, listen,
pat myself on the back for being able to get either one. Hey,
we've had this conversation before. Like, I don't care what you do in the privacy of your own home.
Right.
Like, as long as you're not hurting anybody else and hurting the children, like right. More power to you.
Exactly.
Because just like you don't want to see me and my husband making out in public, that's the same respect that I ask of anybody else. I don't want to see you and Pat making out.
No.
I'm sure you don't want to see me and JR making out. So I'm sure you don't want to see Jane and Jane making out or Bob and Bob making out. So right. Literally, it's just about human decency and respect and learning to love one another, honestly.
Right. It's easy. So we want to create a inclusive resource or services for the LGBTQ youth, especially those experiencing homelessness. I mean, how many people come out to their families about what their preferences are? And that's really not the right way to say that, because I personally don't feel like it's a preference. I feel like
I don't think anybody would choose a harder way of life.
That's exactly what I was about to say. You took it right out of my head.
ESP.
Because I think they're just born this way.
Yeah.
I really do. Mm-hmm. And we need to focus on community-led solutions to help make everybody feel
inclusivity.
Yeah.
Like, I'm one of those people where I grew up in a generation in school that we taught or were taught tolerance. I don't believe in teaching tolerance. I believe in teaching acceptance. I don't, how do I say this? I can tolerate some of my coworkers.
Right.
Right. I accept the job that I do.
Right. There is. And the thing of it is if you tolerate something, that just means you're around them without making a snide comment. But when you accept somebody for who they are, doesn't necessarily mean that you agree with them. It just means that you have come to the conclusion, like an adult, that we disagree on this, and that's okay. And doesn't mean I'm going to disagree with everything. It doesn't mean I'm going to agree with everything. I don't think that there's any one person in the world that somebody agrees with everything that the other person
Absolutely
says.
Not.
I am married to somebody that I love dearly. Lord knows I do not agree with him all the time.
Amen, sister.
And he feels the same way about me. But we accept who we are as people, and we love each other anyways. And I'm not saying you have to love everybody, but if you learn to accept people and respect them,
that's
then
the word.
It really opens up a whole different world. And there are times where I don't know something, and I've gone to a friend and been like, am I doing this right? Am I saying this right?
Yeah.
And nobody has ever been upset with me, or
Because you're wanting to know. There's a difference in asking somebody out of malice and trying to be like malicious or vindictive, and then
Right.
there's a difference with somebody asking for knowledge.
right. And so it's kind of one of those things. Like I said, my first roommate was gay. So I learned a lot about gay culture because a lot of her friends were gay.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, they kind of looked at me funny because I was straight.
Yeah, you were the weird one.
I was the weird one. And they're like, I learned a completely different side of people. And one of the things that I learned with my experience was that the gay community really came together to help one another out no matter what.
Yeah.
So there's a lot you can learn from that.
There's a lot we can learn from one another.
Right. And it just so happened through the grapevine, 6 degrees of separation or whatever, I was working as a nurse at a skilled and assisted living facility. And the ADON son was gay. And I knew that because I had ultimately met him through my roommate.
Your friend, yeah.
And I did not realize they were related until I saw him come into the facility one day to give her lunch. And I saw him and I spoke to him. And he was very flamboyant. But I did not know if his mother knew.
Oh, I see.
If he was gay.
Yeah.
So I was not saying a word.
No.
I mean, in my personal opinion, you'd have to be deaf, blind, and dumb to not know. Because it was kind of one of those very out there. But denial is a real thing.
It is real.
So Ashley wasn't outing this guy for nothing in the world. And, time went on and I never said anything. And I remember Dorothy coming up to me one day and she's just like, she had said something about her son and his boyfriend. And I was just like, yeah, I think we're all going out for drinks later. And she smiled and she pulled down her glasses and she said, I know he's gay, right? And I'm sitting there with my med cart and I'm like, huh? What? And she looked at me and she's just like, really, Ashley? You think I wouldn't know? Do you really think I wouldn't know? And I just kind of got quiet. And she said, the one thing I want to say to you is thank you. She's like, I'm not ashamed of who my son is.
Awesome.
But I want to thank you for being a good friend and not saying anything and holding his secret in case I didn't know.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, at this point, I'm still like, is it a trick?
You're waiting to be punked. Where's Ashton?
Right. I'm like, I'm not so sure about this. I was young. I'm like, I'm not being the one that says anything. And
You've always been a loyal friend.
And so we're out for drinks. I'm like, does your mom know you're gay? Does she know? Does she really know? She told me today she did, but
you didn't confirm it. You didn't co-sign.
And he laughed and he's like, honey, the world knows I'm gay. And I'm like, okay, fine. That's great. Just wanted to make sure we're on the same page. But everybody should feel that way.
Yeah.
But some of the stories that his mother told me when he was younger, that people would spray paint very nasty things on the road in front of him. I'm like,
I believe it.
Who does that?
They're doing it now.
People do that.
They're doing it now.
I'm like, somebody took the time and the money to buy spray paint and go out in the middle of the night and write nastiness on a road for what? Where did that get you?
I'm hoping like a vandalism charge.
Well,
I'm just saying.
Amen.
So people would think like being a mother, having a new baby should be the most joyous time of your life, right? But mothers also experience, suicidal thoughts, attempts, and successes, unfortunately. The questionnaire is given to mothers as part of an Edinburgh Postnatal Depression Scale. It's called the EPDS, which is used to detect postpartum depression among mothers globally. And I know we all have heard, I think by now, about postpartum depression, but back in the day, people were really shamed for it because they didn't know what it was. It didn't have a label. We'll definitely leave a PDF or a link for you guys to look at. And so that way, if you are a mother who's just had a child and are interested in, taking this questionnaire, it'll be there for you. A score of 10 or higher, or a positive answer to question number 10 on this questionnaire, is pretty much indicative of having postpartum depression. The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists recommends screening all women at least once for depression and anxiety during the prenatal period, which is usually defined as the later weeks of pregnancy through the weeks following birth. Suicide is the leading cause of death in postpartum, period. 20% of postpartum deaths are suicidal. Suicide among new mothers is still higher than expected. During the 40-some weeks of pregnancy, your hormone levels increase. They can be out of whack. You've heard of pregnancy brain and all this stuff that happens. And 24 hours after delivery or even a miscarriage or abortion, all those hormones, they're gone. So it's a rapid change there.
Yeah, to say a roller coaster ride insinuates that there's still some there. Like this is jump off a cliff.
Yeah, being pushed off a cliff. I was thinking the same thing.
Like a roller coaster ride is what's happening, you go throughout the pregnancy.
Downs, yeah.
And then afterwards, it's like you just shoved off a cliff.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Those drop in hormones can impact receptors, neurotransmitters, chemical imbalances in the brain. Mm-hmm. You get the baby blues. That's, what we're talking about, postpartum depression. And that happens to about 80% of women, which I knew it was a high number. I just didn't think it was 80%. Like, I find that surprising.
Yeah, I don't know that I find it surprising. I think that we see it as a high number because so many women, I think, try to cover it up.
Yeah, I'm sure because of the stigmatism.
Right. When I had my first child, I remember, and it was very brief, but I remember this overwhelming sense, and I couldn't put my finger on it, but like I'm responsible
for a whole nother
for
life.
A human.
Yeah.
Like that's pressure. That's pressure. And of course, when I had my second child, I guess because I've had one, it was like, okay, I got this. It was a little easier. I didn't have that feeling. Yeah. But with my first child, I remember sitting on the porch and I was just like, holy shit.
This is
real. Like, it's all fun and games and cute and buying stuff when it's in your belly.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
It's kind of self-sufficient, but it comes out.
Yeah, it happens. And then you're like, oh my God, I have to take care of a person.
And it's my responsibility. And I'm going to tell you, no offense to any of the guys that may be listening, but until you push it out of you, there's a whole different thought process of it being your responsibility. I'm sure there are women out there that have and will continue to be able to disconnect from that child. Mm-hmm. But that was a huge pressure on me.
Yeah.
Like, I'm like, well, yeah, it takes two to make it, whatever. I get it. The men are involved. I understand. Doesn't mean they love them any less because they didn't carry them. But that was like a huge, this is my responsibility. Yeah. I grew this person. I gave birth to this person.
You feel as a woman, it's your job to make them successful, productive, well-rounded members of society.
Yes.
It is a lot of pressure to be a mom. So it's not surprising to me that mothers have these thoughts.
Right.
I think I was just surprised about 80% of them having baby blues.
Yeah.
And, having a history of depression or being bipolar or having lack of social support, like you talked about, oh my God, like I'm responsible for this whole other person. Because, sometimes the relationships don't work out. Mom might leave, dad might leave, and you're the one that's having to raise this whole other soul
Yeah,
entirely on your own. And, all of that increases your risk for postpartum depression.
without a doubt. And I had a good support system, so I couldn't imagine not.
And we also have to take into consideration, like you had mentioned before, like there's such a stigmatism behind postpartum depression that the numbers are probably higher. The statistics are probably higher because a lot of it's underreported. And there's really not much research and study going into this. And, it's challenging to differentiate maternal deaths due to suicide from other causes, such as drug overdose related, ones.
They
And
may not
there's
have known that it was a suicide.
exactly like maybe she was just super tired. So instead of taking one sleeping pill, she took like 4. Like, was
Yeah.
that on accident or purpose?
Right.
Right. And, issues of classifications and terms of postpartum depression and peaks in maternal deaths by suicide happen between 9 and 12 months after giving birth. So we are talking about it because it's important and we want to put it out there to educate and, to start conversation. And if you're a new mom, don't feel stigmatized by it. You should be reaching out to your OBGYN or your PCP and sitting down and making an appointment to talk to someone.
Oh, absolutely. Even if the care and help that you need is short-lived, that's okay. That's great, actually. But you still need that help even in that short period of time.
Absolutely.
Another subject we want to touch on with suicide is suicide in healthcare workers. This is something that is very underreported. And one of the reasons it's underreported is because some of the reasons for death are things like overdose, or it's considered accidental, like it wasn't really intentional. So suicide is not listed as a cause of death. And this is off of death certificates.
Yes.
So it's not just somebody pulling random numbers. Physicians have a higher rate of burnout, depressive symptoms, and suicide risk than the general population. And they experience high degrees of mental health distress and are less likely than other members of society to speak out for or seek
help.
seek help for mental health. That was why I was saying earlier that we need to get rid of that stigma in healthcare. The suicide rate among male physicians is 1.4 times higher than the general male population, and female physicians even more so. They're 2.2 times greater than the general female population. 28% of residents experience major depressive episodes during training. That is crazy.
It's so stressful. I mean, yes, you study and you're in college for a certain amount of years, but then when you're starting your residency,
Nothing prepares you for
nothing
that.
Nothing does, because these are live people. They're not cadavers. They're not stimulation or simulator dummies. These are live people. And then you have their lives in your hands. That's overwhelming and stressful.
And no matter how much you study, there's no way that you're going to know and retain that,
Everything,
this person that has this comorbidity and this person that has that comorbidity. And well, then all of a sudden you throw, another wrench into the project. These aren't clean cut cases.
Medicine isn't. It's called the study of the practice of. Yeah.
And there was a study that showed 23% of interns had suicidal thoughts. This is so sad. These are people, healthcare workers, and I don't care what part or how long your training is in healthcare. People dedicate their lives to taking care of people.
I mean, that's stressful enough. I mean,
whether it's a physician down to an aide, they are dedicating their lives because so many healthcare workers, providers take that stuff home with them.
We talked about this in our other episode. Sometimes it's I find it kind of funny because now we're further along in doing this podcast, and we always kind of say, hey, we talked about this
Right.
in a previous episode, but it's hard to turn the switch off.
It is.
Like when you really care and are dedicated about your job, you are that person at 2:00 in the morning thinking about that gravely ill patient.
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
And some of the reasons why the causes for suicide are higher among healthcare professionals are workload, work insufficiency, a lack of autonomy and meaning, and homework conflict. I know personally that I've had family members say, you need to stop. You're at home. You need to just set that down, shut off the email. I was off. I was off.
We told you yesterday, Ashley, to put it down and focus on Ashley.
And so it is hard to just stop especially when you have things that are like, oh, I need to take care of this. And I'm sending out emails and texts. And it's like, I thought you were off. This is a break, not only for you, but for us as well. But it is hard to unplug.
It is.
Sometimes. And the alternative is me like writing it down in my notebook and doing it first thing Monday. And that's fine too. I'm just saying, when you care about the people that you work with, and the patients, it's hard to stop. It's just hard to go, oh, I'm not going to worry about it anymore.
Yeah.
It doesn't work that way. There is an assessment tool that residents can use to help see where they're at.
Yeah, to gauge.
For their mental health. So that's something that they really need to utilize if needed, and seek help. And to back up the healthcare providers, the doctors, will just kind of slide right into nurses. Nurses, the suicide correlates with depression, which that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Got a couple of statistics.
Love numbers. I'm sorry.
It's okay. That's how we get along. So the incident of suicide is about 12 per 100,000 persons a year.
Mm-hmm.
For nurses, it's almost 40 per 100,000.
That's an incredible jump there.
Right.
Incredible.
Yeah.
That's what, 200, 300%?
That's a lot. I can't do math that fast, but
that's incredible.
And of the type of nurses that are out there, nurse anesthetists and retired nurses are actually at higher risk than other nurses, which is completely crazy to me.
Well, the anesthesiology nurses, I can see where there's a lot of stress and pressure with that job. But
oh, absolutely.
Take your whole life. Let's say you've put your whole life into being a nurse. You've put in, I don't know, 65 years. Let's just give or take, since that's the retirement age now. We'll cut it back to 45. Okay. Let's say you spent 45 years of your life being a nurse and then you retire. That's got to be pretty hard to adjust. I think that would be an adjustment period. Yeah.
You go from helping and
then now what do you do?
Now what is it?
Yeah.
That's where finding a hobby for your own mental health is huge.
We talk about hobbies all the time.
Male nurses are 3 to 4 times more likely to complete suicide than females. The method that nurses typically use are pharmaceuticals over firearms, especially for females.
I believe the men are the ones that tend to use more weapons,
right? Where
women tend to use medication,
right? And for gender breakdowns, they estimate that 7% of nurses were men and 93% were women. And that's based on data from 18 states that participated, and suicide rates were matched for adults over age 20.
That's sad.
So work-related mental health syndrome called disengagement and burnout. So this is where understanding your limits as a nurse and where you're at is really important. There is excessive amounts of pressure for nurses. The expectation at work, sometimes you feel like it exceeds what you're able to do. You pair that with these unattainable, quality assurance and goals. And that is a recipe for disaster.
Well, you feel like when you look at this on paper, this would make anybody feel like a freaking failure.
Right.
Like they can't do anything right.
Absolutely. And then if you add into that there is a trust issue with physicians or providers.
There's always that tit for tat between nurses and doctors.
Yes. And I mean, as nurses, you become to learn doctors and you learn patterns and you understand, physiological responses and things like that. And we joke as nurses to say, if we ever go out, here's a list of the doctors that I don't want to work on me.
Oh, absolutely.
That's like one of those, haha, it's funny, but like,
no, I'm for real. No, I'm being for real. And there are nurses like that too. I'd be like, oh my God.
If I woke up and they were over top of me, I
would flip out. I'd be like, give me somebody else.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's making sure that you're in a good place, I think I'm lucky enough to work with great physicians to where if somebody woke over top of me, I'd be like, oh hell, I'm going to owe them more so than give me somebody else.
I can imagine you're going to be owing somebody a lot of Dr. Peppers or Diet Cokes or coffee or bow ties.
It would be one of those things where I'd wake up and they'd be like, yep, you owe me. I'm like, man, just put me back. Just put me back. I didn't mean it. But, then again, we're lucky.
Yeah, we do work for a really brilliant group of doctors, nurse practitioners, and physician assistants.
Yes.
I have not been able to say that of a lot of people that I've worked under.
Oh, so you're being nice. I wouldn't say that for any other group that I've ever worked with.
Yeah. So there's another population of people that are at higher risks of suicide, and we're talking about our veterans, our families, our brothers, our sisters, our mothers, our fathers, our cousins, our family. Absolutely. That have, given any portion of their life to serve in the U.S. military. And crises can be heightened by their experiences during their service. Fortunately, a lot of our veterans suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder and depression. And I want to put out there some of these warning signs because if you have family members that are vets, this is super important. I come from a military family. I'm an Air Force brat.
Yep.
My dad was in the Air Force. My grandfather was in the military. My great-grandfather was in the military. My brother was in the military, and they've all fought in all those wars.
Right.
So here are some warning signs for vets. Appearing sad or depressed most of the time. Hopelessness, feeling like there's no way out. Anxiety, agitation, sleeplessness, or mood swings. Feeling as if there's no reason to be alive. Feeling excessive guilt, shame, or like a sense of failure. Mm-hmm. Being angry, full of rage and just anger. Engaging in risky activities without thinking. Loss of interest in things that they used to love, hobbies, work, school. Increasing alcohol or drug misuse. Neglecting personal welfare. You can physically see a change. Maybe their appearances weren't or aren't as well kept as they used to be. Withdrawing from their family and friends. Showing violent behavior like punching a hole in the wall or getting into fights. They're giving away their prized possessions. When you retire, leave the military, they give you your medals and your awards, and sometimes those are the prized possessions that they tend to give away. They start getting their affairs in orders. They're trying to tie up any loose ends, and they're sitting there, planning and writing their wills. The following signs require immediate attention. If they're thinking about hurting or killing themselves, they need to seek help. If they're looking for ways to kill themselves, they need to seek help. If they're talking about death, dying, or suicide, they need help. Any self-destructive behavior, such as drug abuse, weapons, they need help. And there's a crisis line specifically for veterans called the Veterans Crisis Line. And they can receive help 24 hours a day, 7 days a week by calling 1-800-273-8255 and pressing option 1.
There is a National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. We gave this number earlier. We just want to say it again. That is 1-800-273-TALK or 1-800-273-8255. There is an option that you can go online to suicidepreventionlifeline.org/chat. There is also a way that you can text message if you're in crisis. And what you would just need to do is text the number 741-741. And that will get you an automated response. And then once you respond to that automated response, a live person will connect with you.
Did this.
I did this to make sure that it was an active working number. Of course,
that's kind of
a point, of a good thing to do. And it took about 3 minutes for me to get a response from a live person. And we were immediately having a conversation. Now, of course, I wasn't in crisis. I explained to that person that I was making sure that this crisis line was still open because we did want to talk about it on our podcast. And she was very helpful, very nice. Wow. And the only thing that you have to make sure of is when you send a text that it's 160 characters or less.
Well, yeah, I'm sure.
And it tells you that.
Yeah.
With the automated response.
Yeah, I'm sure there's probably a lot of people texting this line, which is the hopes. That's what they want.
Right.
So they really can't read a soliloquy, but reach out and somebody will reach out to you.
Right. And so that was kind of really a nice option for a lot of people who don't communicate well verbally. And I think that that's something that we're going to see a lot more of with the generation that's growing up with technology.
Going virtual.
And having, kids now at the age of 10 have cell phones and are texting, and that's their main means of communication.
I didn't get a beeper until I was 16, and I just told my age.
Well, and I got a cell phone when I was 18 and could buy my own cell phone. So, yeah.
Oh, my.
I understand that completely.
911. If you can't remember those numbers, because it's a lot.
Yes.
You can always call 911 and they will route you to one of the 163 crisis centers. And counselors, they answered 2.2 million calls last year. So there is help. And whatever numbers you can remember, use them and reach out for help.
Absolutely. And if you're somebody that you have a hard time with depression, or you have suicidal thoughts and you don't really know how to move forward with that, save the number as a contact in your phone.
Absolutely.
You don't have to save it as, suicide hotline. You can save it as anything that that you can remember. So that way it is quick access.
There's good news about this at the end.
Yes.
So, yeah.
We want to kind of go a little bit into the stigma of suicide and mental health. We need to educate everybody and understand that all levels of education suffer from mental health and suicide.
Like we mentioned before, I think within this last I think last year we lost 3 well-known celebrities to suicide.
Right.
So this affects everybody.
It does.
Rich, poor, white, black, everybody in between.
Yes. It doesn't
Educated,
matter if
non-educated.
Exactly.
It affects everybody.
It does. And so understanding that just because somebody appears to have it all doesn't necessarily mean that they're happy, and it does not mean that they feel like they have purpose.
Mm-hmm.
A change to health insurance policies. A lot of people think that if they commit suicide, that they'll leave their loved one in a better place.
Mm-hmm.
You know, then they'll have the money to do some things.
Yeah.
But
there's actually a caveat that a lot of people don't realize.
Yes.
Insurance does not pay out for suicide.
It does not.
Yeah.
Public funding to access for mental health care. There are a lot of places that you can go and you can seek the help.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, you just have to know that it's there.
Absolutely.
And we want to focus always on prevention. I know we talk about that a lot, but if we are sticking with good clinical care, not just for mental, but for physical and substance abuse, it will help with suicide.
Absolutely.
Easy access to a variety of clinical interventions for support and help. Family and community support. Support for ongoing medical and mental health care relationships. You've got to have a good relationship with your counselor or psychologist.
Even your PCP, because if you have trust in them, then you can trust that they're going to refer you to somebody that is really good at their job.
Yes. Skills in problem solving, conflict resolution, and nonviolent ways to handle disputes.
Coping skills. Our ESP is so on point today.
Coping mechanism. You know, I just had a conversation with my child about this last night. I was like, you have got to develop some better coping skills. And she just looked at me. I'm like, yeah.
We all do. I'm an adult and I still could cope a little better with things.
Right.
So, yep.
And so finding the outlets that you need to relieve stress and not just blow up and be able or internalize everything.
Yeah.
They're both bad.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to find that happy medium.
Yes.
Yeah.
And cultural and religious beliefs that discourage suicide and support instincts for self-prevention and preservation.
Absolutely. So this is, I think, the good part of this episode. I had seen some articles and some this mentioned on national news.
Yes.
And I felt like this is one of the reasons why I wanted to do this podcast in particular.
Mm-hmm.
So it's about 988. And this is a new nationwide 3-digit number for a suicide prevention and mental health crisis hotline. It proposes that calls made to 988 would be directed to an existing national suicide prevention line, a national network of 163 crisis centers that is funded by the Department of Health and Human Services, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. The report found that a 3-digit suicide hotline number would likely make it easier for Americans in crisis to access potentially life-saving resources. And the report noted from 1999 to 2016 that suicide increased in 49 of the 50 states. And increase was greater than 20% in more than half of those states. That's a lot.
It is.
The report examined the feasibility of using various digits, including a whole unique 3-digit number like 988 and N11 numbers, and found that the technical and operational issues associated with implementing a 988 could be addressed and resolved more quickly than a consumer re-education effort needed to propose like an alphanumeric number.
Right.
So the FCC has proposed requiring all telephone service providers to accommodate the new 988 number within 18 months. And in July 2020, the Federal Communications Commission's 5 leaders unanimously voted to finalize 988 as the 3-digit number Americans can dial and be directed to the 24/7 National Suicide Hotline. This is a big deal.
It really is. I mean, that's going to be huge because even my children know 911 gets you to emergency.
Mm-hmm.
So that'll be very easy to teach.
Absolutely. I can get the numerical, alphanumerical thing being hard to do a whole education, reform thing about.
Right.
But if we teach 911
we can
in
teach
school,
988.
we can also teach 988 to our children at the same time.
Right.
And I'm just super excited about it.
Right. It's going to be...
It will be life-changing.
Yeah. By July 16th, 2022, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline will consist of that 3-digit, easily remembered phone number, the 988. As suicide is the second leading cause of death for Americans between 10 to 34 years of age, the goal of 988 is to be accessible to all people needing emergency assistance during a suicidal or mental health crisis. So if you or someone you know is experiencing suicidal thoughts, please call 1-800-273-TALK because your life does matter.
As always, we will link our references on our website, www.thenursingpostpodcast.com. We would love for you to join the conversation and leave your comments and suggestions there. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast. Listen to us on your favorite platform, and you can follow us on social media. Thanks again for listening to The Nursing Post.